Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you happened in 1904, and they've been covering it up ever since. In the mountains of Arkansas, a woman named Eliza Thornwood discovered something so horrific that powerful men destroyed her life to keep it buried. She photographed evidence of illegal medical experiments conducted in an abandoned mine. She documented everything in her diary. She tried to warn the authorities, and for her courage, they declared her insane, imprisoned her in her own home, and then burned her alive to silence her forever. But here's what they didn't expect. Her evidence survived. And tonight, you're going to see exactly what she saw, exactly what they killed her for, and exactly why this story has been systematically erased from every history book you've ever read. Because once you understand what really happened in Devil's Den, Arkansas, you'll realize that the same forces that destroyed Eliza Thornwood are still operating today. They're still conducting their experiments. They're still silencing witnesses, and they're still counting on you to remain ignorant of the truth that could change everything you believe about the world you live in. Welcome to the rabbit hole. What you're about to learn will fundamentally alter your understanding of how power operates in the shadows, how truth gets buried, and how witnesses are eliminated when they threaten systems that have been operating for over a century. This isn't just history. This is a blueprint for understanding the mechanisms of control that surround you right now. The men who killed Eliza Thornwood didn't disappear. They evolved. Their methods became more sophisticated. Their reach became global, and their experiments never stopped. Every institution you trust, every authority you respect, every system you believe exists to protect you, all of it traces back to networks that were willing to, murder an innocent woman to protect their secrets. Eliza Thornwood wasn't just a victim, she was a prophet warning about forces that would shape the next century of human history. Forces that are still active, still experimenting, still eliminating anyone who gets too close to the truth. Tonight, you become a witness to what she died trying to expose. And once you know, you can never unknow. Once you see, you can never unsee. The question isn't whether you're ready for this knowledge, it's whether you're brave enough to handle what comes next when you realize that everything you've been told about how the world works has been carefully constructed to keep you from discovering what's really happening in the shadows. Devil's Den, Arkansas wasn't just a place. It was a testing ground. By 1904, this isolated settlement in the Boston Mountains had become the perfect location for activities that required absolute secrecy. Miles from the nearest town, connected only by dirt roads that became impassable during storms. It was a place where screams wouldn't be heard, and witnesses could disappear without questions. The official records tell you it was named for the jagged rock formations that cast shadows across the valleys. But that's not the whole truth. The real reason it earned that name goes back to the 1830s, when the first settlers discovered something unsettling about the limestone caves honeycombed throughout the region. Something that made hardened frontiersmen whisper about unholy ground and cursed earth. The Washington County records that survived the convenient courthouse fire of 1923 mention unexplained disappearances, strange sounds echoing from the caves at night, and livestock found mutilated in ways that suggested neither animal nor natural causes. But these details were classified as local folklore, dismissed as superstition by educated men who understood that controlling information meant controlling reality. What they didn't want you to know is that certain powerful interests had been watching this region for decades, waiting for the right moment to exploit its isolation and establish operations that would revolutionize their understanding of life and death. The geographic isolation wasn't accidental, it was strategic. When you control remote locations, you control what happens there. When you control what happens there, you control what the outside world knows about it. And when you control information, you control reality itself. This principle hasn't changed. Today's isolated facilities, today's black sites, today's off-the-books operations all follow the same blueprint established in places like Devil's Den over a century ago. The men who selected this location understood something fundamental about power. True control requires the ability to operate beyond the reach of conventional oversight. They needed a place where moral constraints could be abandoned, where human subjects could be acquired without documentation, and where experiments could be conducted without interference from authorities who might still possess functioning consciences. What happened in Devil's Den wasn't unique, it was a prototype. A testing ground for methods that would later be implemented on a much larger scale. Harold Thornwood wasn't just a timber merchant, he was a facilitator. His lumber business provided the perfect cover for transportation networks that moved far more than wood through the Arkansas mountains. Railroad expansion meant new opportunities, new routes, and new partnerships with men whose business interests extended far beyond legitimate commerce. When Harold married Eliza in 1899, he gained more than a wife. He acquired someone with medical training whose skills could prove invaluable to his expanding operations. But Eliza wasn't the compliant partner he expected. Her background as a nurse's assistant had taught her to observe, to document, to question inconsistencies that others might overlook. This made her dangerous from the very beginning. The mysterious death of Harold's first wife, Catherine, in 1897 wasn't brain fever, as the records claim. Catherine had discovered something about her husband's business dealings, something that required permanent silencing. The pattern was already established. Women who saw too much didn't live to tell their stories. Harold's marriage to Eliza less than a year later wasn't romance, it was recruitment. He needed someone with medical knowledge for what was coming next. The question that haunted Eliza from their wedding day was simple. Had she married a businessman, or had she been selected by something far more sinister as an unwitting participant in experiments that would redefine the boundaries between life and death? Harold's business connections reveal the true scope of this operation. Railroad officials from St. Louis, timber brokers with connections to pharmaceutical companies, mysterious investors whose wealth couldn't be traced to legitimate sources, all of them connected through networks that operated in the shadows of legitimate commerce. These weren't random business relationships. They were carefully constructed partnerships designed to move resources, materials, and subjects through supply chains that existed parallel to official records. The timber business was perfect cover because it required constant transportation of heavy materials over remote routes. Wagons that officially carried lumber could transport medical equipment, preservation chemicals, and human subjects without raising suspicion. The same routes that moved Harold's legitimate cargo also served darker purposes that would have horrified anyone who understood what was really being transported through those mountain passes under cover of darkness. The Crawford mine closure in 1897 wasn't an accident. It was preparation. 3 men supposedly died in a cave-in, but no bodies were ever recovered. The mine's investors, all mysteriously connected to railroad interests and pharmaceutical companies in St. Louis and Chicago, showed no concern about their lost investment. Instead, they quietly transferred ownership to a shell company that existed only on paper. This should have been your first clue that the Crawford mine was never about extracting limestone or lead. It was about creating an underground facility where certain experiments could be conducted without interference from prying eyes or moral constraints. The mine's layout, according to geological surveys that somehow disappeared from county records, included natural chambers large enough to accommodate significant operations. Underground springs provided fresh water. Multiple entrances allowed for discreet transportation of materials and subjects, and most importantly, the limestone formations created natural sound barriers that would muffle any noise from within. By 1904, while the surface entrance appeared sealed and abandoned, the mine had been converted into something that would have horrified anyone with a functioning moral compass. The equipment being transported inside wasn't for mining, it was medical apparatus designed for procedures that no legitimate hospital would permit, and the subjects of these experiments weren't volunteers. The systematic nature of this conversion tells you everything about the planning involved. This wasn't opportunistic crime, it was institutional operation with backing from interests powerful enough to manipulate official records, control local authorities, and eliminate witnesses. The mine provided perfect conditions: isolated location, natural concealment, acoustic dampening, and multiple escape routes if operations were ever discovered. But here's what should terrify you most. The techniques developed in that underground laboratory didn't stay buried with Eliza Thornwood. They were refined, perfected, and eventually implemented on scales that would have been unimagined. Able in 1904. The experiments conducted in the Crawford mine were prototypes for methods that would later be used in wars, hospitals, and research facilities around the world. Every breakthrough in life extension, every advancement in tissue preservation, every technique for maintaining life beyond natural limits traces back to experiments conducted in places like this underground chamber where human subjects had no rights, no protection, and no voice. Eliza's medical training made her the perfect witness and the perfect target. Her background with Dr. Merriweather in Little Rock had exposed her to surgical procedures, anatomical preservation techniques, and the smell of human tissue under various conditions of decay and manipulation. This knowledge, which Harold initially saw as an asset, became a liability when Eliza began connecting what she observed at the mine with what she had learned in legitimate medical practice. The equipment she photographed wasn't for treating patients, it was for conducting experiments on human subjects who had no voice, no advocates, and no legal protection. Her detailed descriptions in the diary entries recovered by Dr. Calloway reveal someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. Systematic vivisection, experimental preservation techniques, and procedures designed to extend life far beyond natural limits. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Eliza's observations suggest these experiments were succeeding. The wrapped bundles she saw being removed from the mine weren't corpses, they were results. Evidence of techniques that could preserve human tissue indefinitely, reanimate dead matter, and potentially achieve what every powerful man throughout history has desired: victory over death itself. The implications were staggering, and the men conducting these experiments would kill anyone who threatened to expose their work before they could perfect and control it. Eliza understood that she was witnessing the birth of technologies that would give unprecedented power to those who possessed them. The ability to extend life, to preserve consciousness, to defeat death. These weren't theoretical possibilities. They were active research projects being conducted on human subjects in an underground laboratory funded by interests that operated beyond any moral or legal constraints. Her medical knowledge allowed her to recognize what others would have dismissed as impossible. She could identify surgical instruments, understand preservation chemicals, and recognize the signs of successful tissue reanimation. This made her testimony credible and therefore dangerous. A hysterical woman could be dismissed. A medically trained observer who understood exactly what she was documenting could destroy everything they had built. The men who killed Eliza weren't just protecting their current operations, they were protecting the future of human enhancement technologies that would eventually reshape civilization itself. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood wasn't incompetent. He was complicit. His systematic dismissal of Eliza's reports wasn't bureaucratic negligence. It was deliberate obstruction designed to protect operations that reached far beyond Devil's Den. The man responsible for investigating crimes was actively participating in covering them up, which tells you everything you need to know about how deep this conspiracy reached into local government structures. Blackwood's reports describe Eliza as hysterical and delusional, but his own records contradict this assessment. Her observations were detailed, consistent, and included information that only someone with genuine medical knowledge could fabricate. Yet every piece of evidence she brought forward was dismissed, buried, or destroyed before it could reach higher authorities who might actually investigate her claims. This wasn't accidental. Blackwood was receiving instructions from someone with significantly more authority than a county sheriff typically answers to. His decision to exclude the mine area from search operations when Eliza disappeared wasn't oversight. It was protection of an active crime scene. The question that should terrify you is this: if local law enforcement was compromised to this degree in 1904, what makes you think the systems designed to protect you today are any more trustworthy? The same networks that silenced Eliza Thornwood have had over a century to perfect their methods of controlling information and eliminating witnesses. Blackwood's role wasn't unique. He was part of a system that placed loyal operatives in positions of authority, specifically to protect operations that required official cover. Every report he filed, every investigation he refused to conduct, every piece of evidence he destroyed was coordinated with interests that operated far above his pay grade. His subsequent death during an inspection of the mine wasn't accidental either. Once Eliza was eliminated, Blackwood became a liability. He knew too much, had participated too directly, and represented a potential weak point in their security. The men who orchestrated these operations understood that loose ends had to be tied off permanently. Witnesses were eliminated, participants were silenced, and evidence was destroyed systematically to ensure that what happened in Devil's Den would never reach the outside world. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated the power of documentation and the persistence of truth to eventually surface, even decades later. Dr. Edmund Phillips represented something far more sinister than a small-town physician treating nervous women. His credentials, when examined closely, reveal connections to medical institutions in Chicago that specialized in experimental procedures far removed from conventional treatment. His rapid diagnosis of Eliza as delusion, paranoid, wasn't medical assessment, it was professional character assassination designed to discredit a witness before her testimony could gain credibility. The bromide treatments he prescribed weren't therapy. They were chemical restraints designed to cloud Eliza's mind and make her appear unstable to anyone who might listen to her claims. Phillips understood exactly what Eliza had witnessed because he was part of the network conducting the experiments. His role was to provide medical cover for operations that required someone with legitimate credentials to sign reports, issue death certificates, and declare inconvenient witnesses mentally incompetent. The speed with which he appeared in Devil's Den after Eliza's initial reports suggests he was specifically called in to handle a situation that threatened exposure. His subsequent death by morphine overdose wasn't suicide. It was elimination of a liability who had served his purpose and become a potential security risk. Phillips's background reveals the sophisticated nature of this conspiracy. These weren't local criminals operating independently. They were part of a coordinated network that included medical professionals, law enforcement officials, business leaders, and government operatives, all working together to advance research projects that required absolute secrecy. The medical establishment's complicity in silencing Eliza demonstrates how institutions that claim to heal and protect can be corrupted to serve interests that view human life as experimental material. Phillips' willingness to chemically incapacitate a witness, to falsify medical records, and to participate in operations that violated every ethical principle of medical practice shows how easily professionals can be recruited into systems that operate beyond moral constraints. His death pattern, the convenient overdose that eliminated a potential witness, became a template for removing liabilities throughout the 20th century. Medical professors, scientists who participated in unauthorized experiments, who falsified records to protect classified operations, who used their credentials to legitimize activities that would horrify ethical practitioners, all faced the same fate when they became more dangerous alive than dead. The networks that recruited Phillips have evolved, but never disappeared. When Eliza began her own investigation in late May 1904, she crossed a line that sealed her fate. Her decision to collect soil samples, document evidence, and photograph the mine operations transformed her from a dismissed witness into an active threat that required immediate elimination. The samples she described hiding beneath the floorboards of the root cellar weren't random dirt. They were material evidence of human experimentation that could be analyzed by independent authorities. Her recognition of the odor as similar to what she had encountered during medical training in Little Rock proves she understood exactly what she was documenting. The smell of human tissue exposed to air for prolonged periods isn't something you forget, and it isn't something that occurs naturally in abandoned mining operations. What Eliza detected was the aftermath of surgical procedures conducted on living subjects, procedures that left organic waste that had to be disposed of somewhere. The soil samples would have contained traces of blood, tissue fragments, and preservation chemicals used in the experimental procedures. In an era before sophisticated forensic analysis, these samples might not have provided conclusive proof, but they would have been enough to justify official investigation by authorities, not controlled by the conspiracy. Eliza's systematic approach to gathering evidence demonstrates the thoroughness that made her so dangerous. She wasn't content to simply report what she had observed. She was building a case that could withstand scrutiny and force accountability. Her medical training had taught her the importance of documentation, the value of physical evidence, and the necessity of creating records that couldn't be dismissed or destroyed. But her investigation also revealed the scope of what she was up against. The wagon tracks leading to the river crossing suggested a supply chain that extended far beyond Devil's Den. The connection to Fayetteville indicated transportation networks that could move materials and subjects across significant distances. The involvement of supposedly legitimate businessmen like William Garrett proved that the operation had backing from interests with resources and connections that reached into corporate and government circles. When Eliza realized she was documenting evidence of systematic human experimentation backed by powerful institutional interests, she understood that her life was forfeit. The only question was whether she could get her evidence to authorities who weren't compromised before they silenced her permanently. The photographic plates Eliza exposed on the night of June 18th contained evidence that could have changed history. The Brownie camera she ordered from Sears represented democratized documentation technology that threatened traditional information control systems for the first time. Before portable cameras, powerful interests could control what was documented and what remained hidden. Photography changed everything by putting evidence-gathering capability into the hands of ordinary citizens. What Eliza captured on those plates wasn't just suspicious activity, it was documentation of systematic human experimentation that violated every legal and moral standard of the era. The medical equipment she photographed being transported into the mine, the wrapped bundles being removed, the participation of supposedly respectable businessmen in nighttime operations, all of it would have provided irrefutable proof that something horrific was happening in Devil's Den. But more importantly, her photographs would have established the institutional nature of these operations. This wasn't random criminal activity, it was coordinated experimentation backed by resources and authority that extended far beyond local capabilities. The equipment she documented was expensive, specialized, and suggested backing from medical or scientific institutions with significant funding. Harold's immediate confiscation of the plates proves he understood their significance. His reaction wasn't surprise or confusion. It was calculated damage control by someone who knew exactly what those images contained and what they could prove. His departure with the plates, followed by their permanent disappearance, demonstrates coordination with interests that had protocols for handling exposure risks. The existence of a darkroom in Harold's home suggests the operation had capabilities for processing evidence internally, which means they could examine what Eliza had captured before deciding how to respond. This level of preparation indicates sophisticated operational security that went far beyond what local criminals could organize independently. When those plates disappeared, the physical evidence of systematic human experimentation disappeared with them. But the knowledge of what they contained lived on in Eliza's diary, creating a documentary record that would eventually surface decades later when Dr. Calloway discovered her writings. The men who destroyed the photographs couldn't eliminate the witness who had taken them, at least not immediately. That would require more permanent solutions. Eliza's 3-day disappearance in June 1904 wasn't a breakdown. It was kidnapping, interrogation, and psychological warfare designed to determine how much she knew and who else might have access to her information. The fact that she reappeared at a newspaper office 30 miles away rather than returning home tells you everything about her state of mind and the danger she understood she was facing. The journey from Devil's Den to Fayetteville would have been nearly impossible for a woman traveling alone unless she had assistance or was transported by someone else. The most likely explanation is that she was taken against her will, questioned about her evidence and contacts, and then released with a clear understanding that her every move was being monitored. Her arrival at the newspaper office with a leather satchel suggests she had prepared for this possibility. The contents of that satchel, whether additional evidence, copies of photographs, or documentation she had kept separate from her home, represented her insurance policy. By delivering it to editor James Simmons, she was attempting to ensure that someone outside the local conspiracy would have access to her evidence. The 40-minute private conversation with Simmons, followed by his immediate telegraph messages to both law enforcement and medical authorities, indicates that whatever Eliza shared was credible enough to prompt immediate action. A newspaper editor wouldn't risk his reputation and business by taking action on obviously false claims. Simmons believed what Eliza showed him, which means her evidence was compelling enough to convince a professional skeptic. But the newspaper's failure to publish any story related to her claims proves how quickly powerful interests could suppress information, even when it reached supposedly independent media. Simmons's subsequent drowning during a fishing expedition fits the pattern of convenient accidents that eliminated witnesses throughout this case. Eliza's willingness to leave the satchel with Simmons rather than take it home demonstrates her understanding that her house was no longer safe. She knew she was being watched, that her every action was being monitored, and that any evidence she possessed would be confiscated if discovered. Her strategic thinking in this moment shows someone who understood she was engaged in information. Eliza's confinement in her own home during July 1904 represents a masterclass in psychological control and systematic isolation. The removal of her door, the confiscation of her outdoor clothing, and the daily administration of mind-clouding drugs weren't medical treatment. They were detention and interrogation techniques designed to break her will and extract information about any evidence she might have shared with outside contacts. The voices she heard through her door, including unfamiliar men who weren't from the area, indicate that specialists had been brought in to handle what was now considered a security crisis. These weren't local conspirators panicking about exposure. These were professionals experienced in managing witnesses who had gathered dangerous information. The sophistication of their approach, chemical restraints, psychological isolation, systematic monitoring, suggests military or intelligence training. Her diary entries from this period reveal someone fighting to maintain mental clarity while being systematically drugged and psychologically manipulated. Her decision to appear sedated while remaining alert demonstrates the kind of strategic thinking that made her such a dangerous opponent. Even under chemical influence, even while imprisoned in her own home, she continued to gather intelligence about her captors and their plans. The conversation she overheard about the facility reveals the scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about silencing one witness. It was about protecting an institutional operation that had infrastructure, protocols, and resources that extended far beyond Devil's Den. The work at the mine was described as too important to risk exposure, indicating that the experiments were yielding results significant enough to justify extreme measures to protect them. Her recognition of one of the men administering her medication as someone she had photographs at the mine confirms the systematic nature of her persecution. These weren't random criminals. They were the same individuals conducting the experiments, now personally involved in eliminating the witness who had documented their activities. The fact that he smiled when he saw recognition in her eyes reveals the psychological sadism of professionals who enjoyed the power they wielded over their victims. The methodical nature of her confinement, the coordination between her husband and outside specialists, and the clear preparation for permanent relocation all indicate that Eliza was being processed through a system designed to handle inconvenient witnesses who possessed dangerous knowledge. The revelation in Eliza's final diary entries that she heard the sound of a bone saw coming from Harold's study transforms our understanding of the entire operation. This wasn't just about experiments conducted at the remote mine site. Harold's own home had been converted into an auxiliary facility where additional procedures were being performed. The reinforced storage room adjacent to his study, supposedly for geological specimens, was actually a private laboratory where human subjects could be processed. Eliza's medical training made her uniquely qualified to recognize the distinctive sound of surgical tools being used on bone and tissue. The fact that these sounds were coming from directly below her bedroom means that while she was being chemically restrained and psychologically tormented, active experimentation was continuing in the basement of her own home. The psychological impact of this realization that she had been living above a torture chamber for months or possibly years explains the desperation in her final entries. The timing of these activities, coinciding with her confinement and drugging, suggests that her captors had become bold enough to conduct their work directly under her nose, possibly as a form of psychological torture designed to break her remaining resistance. But they wanted her to understand that she was completely powerless, that her own home had been transformed into an extension of their experimental facility, and that there was no safe space left in her world. Harold's dual role as husband and operational coordinator represents the ultimate betrayal. He had married her specifically to gain access to her medical knowledge, used her skills to support his operations, and then systematically destroyed her when she became a liability. The man she trusted most had been instrumental in every aspect of her persecution, from the initial recruitment through the final elimination. The bone saw sounds also indicate that the experiments had progressed beyond simple vivisection to more complex procedures involving skeletal manipulation, possibly related to preservation techniques or reanimation attempts. The work being conducted in Harold's basement wasn't preliminary research. It was advanced experimentation that required immediate access to fresh subjects and immediate disposal of evidence. When Eliza barricaded her door on July 10th, she wasn't just protecting herself from psychological manipulation. She was trying to prevent her own transformation into another experimental subject. The house fire on July 12, 1904, was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated elimination operation designed to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and create a plausible explanation for the disappearance of Eliza Thornwood. The fire's origin in the basement, specifically in the area where Eliza had hidden her soil samples, wasn't coincidental. It was targeted destruction of physical evidence that could have proven human experimentation was taking place. The fire inspector's initial determination that accelerants were used, later amended to attribute the rapid spread to natural causes, demonstrates how quickly official investigations could become compromised and evidence manipulated to support desired narratives. The speed of the fire's spread suggests professional knowledge of combustion techniques designed to ensure complete destruction of specific areas while creating maximum confusion about the cause. Harold's injuries, severe enough to cause his death 3 days later, weren't the result of heroic rescue attempts. Thomas Craven's observation that Harold emerged from the tree line rather than from the house itself indicates he was returning to the scene rather than fleeing from it. His burned clothing and injuries suggest he was caught in the fire while conducting final evidence destruction operations that required his personal attention. The neighbor's observation of a loaded wagon at the edge of the property proves premeditation. Someone had been systematically removing materials, equipment, and evidence before the fire began. By morning, both the wagon and its contents had vanished, indicating coordination with outside personnel who ensured nothing traceable survived the operation. Harold's death wasn't an unexpected tragedy. It was a planned elimination that served multiple purposes. It removed a key conspirator who possessed detailed knowledge of the entire operation, created a sympathetic narrative of a husband dying while trying to save his wife, and eliminated someone who might have become a liability if questioned by authorities outside the local conspiracy. The systematic nature of this destruction, targeted basement fire, elimination of key personnel, removal of physical evidence, and creation of a tragic cover story, demonstrates operational sophistication that could only have been achieved with institutional backing and professional expertise in evidence destruction. The deaths of Dr. Phillips, Sheriff Blackwood, and editor James Simmons within 3 weeks of the Thornwood fire represent systematic elimination of potential witnesses who possessed knowledge that could have exposed the entire operation. These weren't coincidental tragedies. They were coordinated assassinations designed to ensure that everyone who had participated in or learned about the Devil's Den experiments would never be able to testify about what they had witnessed. Dr. Phillips' death by morphine overdose follows the classic pattern of medical professionals eliminated after participating in unauthorized experiments. His access to drugs made suicide appear plausible, but his timing, immediately after the fire that was supposed to end the crisis, suggests he was killed because he represented an ongoing security risk. Medical professionals who compromise their ethics for experimental operations often develop consciences or demand additional compensation, making them liabilities that must be eliminated. Sheriff Blackwood's fatal accident during inspection of the mine wasn't curiosity about unstable structures. It was final evidence destruction that required someone with official authority to ensure the site was completely sanitized. His death during this process suggests either accidental exposure to elimination techniques being used on the site, or intentional removal of the last local official who could connect the mine operations to outside interests. James Simmons's drowning represents the most troubling elimination because it directly targeted someone who had received evidence from Eliza and was positioned to expose the entire conspiracy through independent media. His death proves that the networks protecting these operations had the capability and willingness to eliminate threats across multiple locations, not just within the immediate Devil's Den area. The 3-week time frame for these eliminations indicates coordinated planning and professional execution by individuals experienced in witness elimination. This wasn't panic-driven violence. It was systematic cleanup conducted by specialists who understood terms. Every person connected to the operation had to be permanently silenced to prevent future exposure. The fact that all 3 deaths were accepted without investigation by higher authorities demonstrates how thoroughly the cover-up networks had infiltrated law enforcement and government oversight systems throughout the region. Now, I want you to comment below, "The truth sets you free," if you're ready to go deeper into this rabbit hole. Comment it twice to show the algorithm you're committed to discovering what they've hidden from you for over a century. The systematic elimination of witnesses following Eliza's death reveals the true scope of what she had discovered. This wasn't a local criminal conspiracy that could be contained through intimidation and bribery. This was an institutional operation with resources, authority, and reach that extended across multiple states and government agencies. The ability to coordinate simultaneous eliminations, manipulate official investigations, and ensure media silence required connections that reached the highest levels of political and financial power. What makes this truly terrifying is the realization that the experiments Eliza documented weren't isolated research projects. They were part of a larger program designed to develop technologies that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in human civilization. The techniques being perfected in the Crawford mine weren't just about extending life or preserving tissue. They were about achieving ultimate control over the biological processes that govern human existence. The men funding these operations understood that whoever controlled life extension technologies would possess unprecedented power over every individual, every government, and every institution on Earth. The ability to grant or deny extended life, to preserve consciousness beyond natural death, to enhance human capabilities beyond normal limits. These technologies would make their possessors the ultimate arbiters of human destiny. Eliza Thornwood died because they returned to expose research that would eventually reshape the entire structure of human society. The experiments she witnessed were preliminary steps toward developments that would transform medicine, warfare, governance, and social organization in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1904. The networks that killed her weren't just protecting current operations. They were protecting the future of human enhancement technologies that would eventually allow small groups of enhanced individuals to dominate vast populations of normal humans. Every breakthrough in life extension, every advance in genetic manipulation, every development in consciousness preservation traces back to experiments conducted in places like Devil's Den by organizations willing to sacrifice any number of lives to achieve technological supremacy. The men who eliminated Eliza understood that controlling the future of human evolution required controlling the research that would make that evolution possible. Dr. James Calloway's discovery of Eliza's documents in 1964 represents a crucial moment when buried truth briefly surfaced before being suppressed once again. The fact that his research was abruptly defunded after uncovering materials that had survived for 60 years proves that the networks responsible for Eliza's death remained active and vigilant throughout the 20th century, continuously monitoring for any evidence that might expose their historical operations. The systematic suppression of Calloway's work demonstrates how academic institutions, supposedly dedicated to discovering and preserving truth, can be controlled and manipulated to serve interests that require historical concealment. University research programs, scholarly publications, and academic careers can be destroyed as easily as individual lives when they threaten to expose information that powerful networks need to keep buried. Calloway's research materials being archived in special collections where they remained largely forgotten until accidentally discovered during renovation represents the institutional memory holing that allows dangerous information to be preserved while ensuring it remains inaccessible to public scrutiny. This technique, controlled preservation rather than complete destruction, allows networks to maintain access to historical information while preventing general awareness of its significance. The microfiche copy discovered in 1968 suggests that even within suppression systems, individual actors sometimes work to preserve evidence for future discovery. Someone within the university system understood the importance of Calloway's findings and took action to ensure they would survive institutional censorship. This indicates that even the most comprehensive control systems contain individuals who retain moral autonomy and work to preserve truth, despite professional risks. But the fact that these materials remained buried for decades after their rediscovery proves how effectively information can be contained even when it technically exists in accessible archives. Most people never think to look for evidence of historical conspiracies, and those who do often lack the resources or persistence necessary to navigate institutional barriers designed to discourage investigation. The survival of Eliza's story through Calloway's work represents both the persistence of truth and the fragility of historical memory in systems designed to control information flow. The technological capabilities demonstrated in the Devil's Den experiments of 1904 suggest access to knowledge and techniques that were decades ahead of publicly acknowledged medical science. The equipment Eliza described being transported into the mine, the preservation techniques she observed, and the apparent success of reanimation experiments indicate that certain networks possessed advanced biotechnology that wouldn't become publicly available until much later in the 20th century. This raises fundamental questions about the relationship between public scientific progress and classified research programs that operate beyond academic and government oversight. How much of what we consider recent medical breakthroughs actually represents the controlled release of technologies that have been developed and perfected in secret facilities for decades or even centuries? The experiments Eliza witnessed suggest that by 1904, certain groups had already achieved capabilities in tissue preservation, life extension, and possibly consciousness transfer that mainstream science wouldn't acknowledge as possible until the 1950s or later. This indicates that technological development follows two parallel tracks: public science that advances according to official timelines and classified research that operates decades ahead of acknowledged capabilities. The implications are staggering. Every medical breakthrough you've been told represents cutting-edge research might actually be controlled disclosure of technologies that have been refined and perfected in facilities like the Crawford mine for generations. The same networks that killed Eliza Thornwood have had over a century to develop applications of the technologies she documented, while carefully managing public awareness to maintain their advantage. Consider how this affects everything you believe about human potential, medical treatment, and technological progress. If life extension technologies existed in primitive form in 1904, what capabilities do these networks possess today? If consciousness preservation was being researched over a century ago, what level of control over human identity and memory might be possible now? The men who eliminated Eliza weren't just protecting experimental research, they were protecting technological advantages that would allow them to transcend normal human limitations while keeping the general population dependent on controlled, inferior versions of the same technologies. The geographic isolation of Devil's Den reveals a pattern that extends far beyond Arkansas. Throughout American history, remote locations with specific characteristics, geographic isolation, natural concealment features, sparse populations, and limited government oversight have been systematically selected for operations that require absolute secrecy. Devil's Den wasn't unique. It was part of a network of sites chosen for their operational advantages. The limestone cave systems that honeycombed the Arkansas mountains provided perfect natural laboratories where experiments could be conducted without detection. Underground chambers offered climate control, acoustic dampening, and protection from external observation. Multiple entrance points allowed for discreet transportation of materials and subjects. Natural water sources supported extended operations without requiring external infrastructure that might attract attention. But most importantly, these locations were selected for their distance from population centers where missing persons might be noticed and investigated. Rural areas with transient populations, limited law enforcement, and economic dependence on industries controlled by the same networks conducting the experiments provided ideal hunting grounds for acquiring human subjects who wouldn't be missed. The pattern established in places like Devil's Den was replicated throughout the 20th century as these networks expanded their operations. Remote military bases, isolated research facilities, private compounds in wilderness areas, and offshore installations all follow the same operational model pioneered in locations like the Crawford Mine. Geographic isolation remains the foundation of operations that cannot withstand public scrutiny. Today's black sites, undisclosed research facilities, and classified installations represent the evolution of techniques first perfected in places like Devil's Den. The same principles that made Arkansas caves perfect for early human experimentation continue to guide site selection for operations that push the boundaries of legal and ethical constraints. When you understand how geographic isolation enables systematic human experimentation, you begin to recognize how many current research facilities and military installations might be conducting activities that would horrify you if their true purposes were revealed. The transportation networks that moved subjects, equipment, and materials through the Arkansas mountains in 1904 established logistical capabilities that would become the foundation for much larger operations throughout the 20th century. Harold Thornwood's timber business provided legitimate cover for moving heavy equipment and concealed cargo over routes that connected remote experimental sites with urban supply sources and disposal locations. The railroad connections that linked Devil's Den to St. Louis, Chicago, and other major cities weren't just commercial relationships. They were supply chains that moved human subjects from population centers to experimental facilities and transported research materials back to institutions where results could be analyzed and applied. The same trains that carried legitimate cargo also transported evidence of systematic human experimentation to networks of complicit medical and scientific institutions. Eliza's observation of wagon tracks leading to river crossings reveals how these operations connected multiple transportation modes to create supply chains that could move materials across vast distances while maintaining operational security. Ferry operators, wagon drivers, railroad personnel, and shipping agents all became unwitting participants in networks that relied on compartmentalized knowledge to prevent any individual from understanding the full scope of what they were supporting. The sophistication of these logistics networks indicates institutional backing with resources far exceeding local capabilities, moving specialized medical equipment, preservation chemicals, and human subjects across multiple states while maintaining secrecy required coordination, financing, and authority that could only have come from organizations with significant political and economic power. These transportation networks didn't disappear when the Devil's Den operations were exposed. They evolved into the supply chains that support today's classified research programs, military operations, and corporate activities that operate beyond public oversight. The same principles that enabled systematic human experimentation in 1904 continue to facilitate activities that require moving sensitive materials and personnel without attracting attention or creating official records. Understanding how these logistics networks function is crucial for recognizing how contemporary operations maintain secrecy while conducting activities on scales that would have been impossible in Eliza's time. The medical establishment's complicity in suppressing Eliza's testimony reveals how professional institutions can be corrupted to serve interests that directly contradict their stated missions. Dr. Phillips' willingness to falsify medical records, prescribe chemical restraints to silence a witness, and participate in operations that violated every principle of medical ethics demonstrates how individual professionals can be recruited into systems that subvert institutional purpose. Medical institutions possess unique advantages for conducting unauthorized human experimentation: access to subjects through patient populations, authority to prescribe treatments that alter mental capacity, ability to issue death certificates that conceal actual causes of death, and professional credibility that makes their assessments difficult to challenge. All of these capabilities can be weaponized by networks that understand how to exploit institutional trust. The speed with which Dr. Phillips arrived in Devil's Den and the systematic nature of his approach to discrediting Eliza suggests that recruitment and deployment of complicit medical professionals was already an established protocol by 1904. This wasn't improvised crisis management, it was implementation of procedures designed specifically for managing witnesses who possessed dangerous medical knowledge. The pattern established by Phillips' involvement, medical professionals providing cover for systematic human experimentation while using their authority to silence witnesses, became a template that was refined and expanded throughout the 20th century. Military medical programs, pharmaceutical research initiatives, and psychiatric institutions all became vehicles for conducting experiments on human subjects who had no legal protection or advocacy. Today's medical establishment continues to be vulnerable to the same corrupting influences that turned Dr. Phillips into an accessory to murder. Professional pressures, financial incentives, career advancement opportunities, and institutional loyalty can all be manipulated to recruit medical professionals into activities that violate their training and ethical commitments. When you understand how easily medical authority can be corrupted to serve interests that view human beings as experimental material, you begin to question every institutional assurance about medical safety, informed consent, and patient protection that you've been conditioned to trust without investigation. The psychological warfare techniques used against Eliza during her confinement represent early applications of methods that would later be refined and systematized in military and intelligence operations throughout the 20th century. Chemical restraints, sensory isolate, iron, psychological manipulation, and systematic disorientation weren't random cruelty. They were deliberate applications of principles designed to break individual will and extract information. Her captors understood that controlling someone's mental state was more effective than physical violence for achieving compliance and preventing resistance. By clouding her thoughts with drugs while maintaining enough awareness to understand her powerlessness, they created psychological conditions that would maximize her despair while minimizing her ability to plan or execute escape attempts. The removal of her door, confiscation of her clothing, and constant monitoring weren't just imprisonment techniques. They were systematic destruction of personal autonomy designed to create learned helplessness and psychological dependence on her captors. These methods represent early applications of psychological control techniques that would later be perfected in military interrogation programs and psychiatric manipulation protocols. Her ability to maintain mental clarity despite chemical influence and her strategic decision to appear sedated while remaining alert demonstrate the kind of intellectual resistance that made her such a dangerous opponent. Even under systematic psychological attack, she continued to gather intelligence and plan resistance, proving that individual will can persist even under extreme manipulation. The conversation she overheard about the facility reveals that her psychological processing was preliminary to permanent relocation to an institutional setting where more intensive techniques could be applied without interference from potential outside observers. This suggests that the networks conducting these operations had access to facilities specifically designed for long-term psychological manipulation and behavior modification. The techniques developed for controlling Eliza Thornwood became prototypes for methods that would later be applied on much larger scales in psychiatric institutions, military programs, and social control operations designed to manage populations rather than individuals. The fire that destroyed the Thornwood residence represents the perfection of evidence destruction techniques that would become standard protocols for eliminating traces of unauthorized operations. The targeting of specific areas, particularly the basement where experiments were conducted and the root cellar where physical evidence was hidden, demonstrates detailed knowledge of what needed to be destroyed and sophisticated understanding of combustion techniques required to ensure complete elimination. The fire's rapid spread and the systematic removal of materials before ignition indicate professional expertise in evidence destruction that goes far beyond what local conspirators could have organized independently. This was implementation of protocols developed by specialists who understood how to eliminate physical evidence, eliminate witnesses, and create plausible cover stories that would prevent investigation by outside authorities. Harold's death during the fire serves multiple operational purposes. Elimination of a key conspirator who possessed detailed knowledge of the entire operation, creation of a tragic narrative that would discourage investigation, and removal of someone who might have become a liability if questioned by authorities outside the local conspiracy. His timing suggests he was conducting final evidence destruction that required personal attention to ensure nothing traceable survived. The coordination between the fire, the systematic elimination of other witnesses, and the suppression of media coverage demonstrates operational sophistication that could only have been achieved through institutional backing and professional expertise. This wasn't panic-driven crisis management, it was implementation of predetermined protocols designed for situations where operations faced potential expo. Sure, the techniques perfected in the Thornwood fire, simultaneous elimination of physical evidence and human witnesses, creation of plausible, alternative explanations, and coordination with complicit authorities to prevent investigation, became standard methods for managing exposure risks throughout the 20th century. Every mysterious fire that has eliminated inconvenient evidence, every convenient accident that has silenced dangerous witnesses, every systematic destruction of materials that could have exposed unauthorized operations follows the blueprint established in Devil's Den in 1904. The institutional networks revealed through the Devil's Den case demonstrate how power operates through coordinated relationships between seemingly independent organizations. Medical institutions, law enforcement agencies, media organizations, business interests, and government authorities all participated in suppressing evidence and eliminating witnesses, indicating systematic coordination that reaches far beyond local conspiracy. The speed with which multiple institutions responded to Eliza's threats, medical professionals arriving to discredit her testimony, law enforcement refusing to investigate her claims, media outlets suppressing her evidence, and business networks coordinating witness elimination, proves that protocols for managing exposure risks were already established and ready for implementation. This level of coordination requires communication systems, command structures, and operational procedures that connect institutions across multiple jurisdictions and professional sectors. The networks that killed Eliza Thornwood weren't ad hoc criminal conspiracies. They were elements of larger organizational systems designed to protect operations that span multiple institutions and operate beyond traditional oversight mechanisms. The financial resources required to coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple states the authority necessary to manipulate official investigations, and the expertise needed to eliminate witnesses professionally all indicate backing from interests with resources far exceeding local capabilities. These operations required institutional support from organizations with national or international reach. The persistence of these networks throughout the 20th century, evidenced by their ability to suppress Dr. Calloway's research in 1964, proves that the organizational systems revealed through the Devil's Den case weren't temporary arrangements. They were permanent structures designed to protect operations that continued long after Eliza's elimination. Understanding how these institutional networks coordinate to suppress dangerous information and eliminate threats is crucial for recognizing how similar systems operate today to protect contemporary operations that require secrecy and cannot withstand public scrutiny. The technological implications of what Eliza witnessed extend far beyond the medical procedures she documented. The experiments conducted in the Crawford mine represent early research into technologies that would eventually enable unprecedented control over human biology, consciousness, and social organization. Life extension techniques, consciousness preservation methods, and biological enhancement technologies all have implications that reach far beyond individual medical treatment. The ability to extend life indefinitely creates power dynamics that would fundamentally alter every existing social, economic, and political system. Individuals with access to life extension technologies would accumulate resources, knowledge, and influence over timeframes that would make them effectively immortal rulers over populations with normal lifespans. This represents the ultimate concentration of power in human history. Consciousness preservation techniques would enable the transfer of individual identity between biological substrates, potentially allowing the same consciousness to inhabit multiple bodies or survive biological death through artificial preservation. This technology would eliminate the natural constraints that prevent unlimited accumulation of personal power and influence. Biological enhancement technologies would create artificial distinctions between enhanced individuals with superior capabilities and normal humans with natural limitations. Enhanced populations would possess cognitive, physical, and sensory abilities that would make them effectively superhuman compared to unenhanced populations, creating permanent caste systems based on technological access rather than natural characteristics. The experiments Eliza documented weren't just medical research. They were preliminary steps toward technologies that would enable small groups of enhanced individuals to achieve permanent dominance over vast populations of normal humans. The networks that killed her weren't just protecting current operations. They were protecting the foundation for technological advantages that would reshape the entire structure of human civilization. Every breakthrough in these fields since 1904 has brought these networks closer to achieving capabilities that would make them the ultimate arbiters of human destiny, with power over life, death, consciousness, and biological capability that would eclipse any authority in human history. The pattern of witness elimination established in the Devil's Den case became the template for managing exposure risks throughout the 20th century and beyond. The systematic removal of everyone who possessed knowledge about the experiments, from direct participants like Dr. Phillips to external threats like James Simmons, demonstrates protocols for eliminating human liabilities that have been refined and applied countless times since 1904. Medical professionals who participate in unauthorized experiments face elimination when they become security risks through demands for additional compensation, development of ethical concerns, or simple knowledge of too many operational details. The morphine overdose that killed Dr. Phillips became a standard method for removing medical personnel who had served their purpose and become liabilities. Law enforcement officials who coordinate evidence suppression and witness intimidation face similar elimination when their knowledge becomes more dangerous than their cooperation is valuable. Sheriff Blackwood's death during mine inspection represents cleanup of local officials who possessed too much operational knowledge to be allowed to survive long-term. Media personnel who receive dangerous information face elimination regardless of their willingness to suppress publication because their knowledge represents permanent security risks that cannot be managed through intimidation or bribery. James Simmons's drowning demonstrates that even cooperative media figures are eliminated when they possess information that could eventually surface through investigation or testimony. The 3-week time frame for these eliminations indicates systematic implementation of predetermined protocols rather than improvised crisis response. Professional teams with specific expertise in witness elimination were deployed to handle a situation that required coordinated removal of multiple individuals across different locations and professional categories. These elimination protocols haven't disappeared. They've been refined, expanded, and systematized to handle much larger numbers of potential witnesses in contemporary operations that require absolute secrecy. Every mysterious death that eliminates someone who possessed inconvenient knowledge follows patterns established in Devil's Den over a century ago. The suppression of Dr. Calloway's research in 1964 proves that the networks responsible for Eliza's death remained active and vigilant 60 years after her elimination. The ability to identify, track, and suppress academic research that threatened to expose historical operations demonstrates continuous monitoring systems that span multiple generations and institutional changes. Academic institutions provide perfect cover for suppressing dangerous information because they can eliminate research through administrative procedures that appear legitimate to outside observers. Funding cancellations, tenure denials, publication rejections, and archival restrictions all provide plausible mechanisms for preventing information from reaching public awareness while maintaining institutional credibility. The fact that Calloway's materials were preserved in special collections rather than destroyed completely suggests sophisticated information management that maintains access for authorized personnel while preventing general availability. This technique allows networks to retain historical knowledge for operational purposes while ensuring public ignorance of activities that must remain classified. The accidental rediscovery of microfiche copies during renovation demonstrates that even comprehensive suppression systems cannot eliminate every trace of dangerous information. Individual actors within institutions sometimes work to preserve evidence despite official policies, creating hidden archives that can surface unexpectedly when circumstances permit. But the continued burial of this information for decades after its rediscovery proves how effectively access can be controlled, even when materials technically exist in public archives. Most researchers lack the knowledge, resources, or persistence necessary to locate and analyze evidence that has been systematically obscured through institutional procedures designed to discourage investigation. The networks that suppress academic research today possess capabilities far exceeding what was available in 1964, including digital surveillance, algorithmic content suppression, and global coordination that can eliminate information across multiple platforms and institutions simultaneously. The South-Sib-Bad-Seam techniques that buried Calloway's work have evolved into comprehensive systems for managing public knowledge about any topic these networks need to keep classified. The medical equipment that Eliza photographed being transported into the Crawford mine represents technology that was decades ahead of publicly acknowledged capabilities in 1904. Surgical instruments, preservation apparatus, and monitoring equipment that she described suggest access to knowledge and manufacturing capabilities that mainstream medicine wouldn't possess until much later in the 20th century. This technological advancement indicates that certain networks possessed research and development capabilities that operated parallel to and ahead of official scientific progress. While public medical institutions struggled with basic surgical techniques and had limited understanding of tissue preservation, the operations in Devil's Den were conducting experiments that required sophisticated equipment and advanced procedural knowledge. The implications are staggering. How much of what you consider cutting-edge medical technology actually represents controlled disclosure of capabilities that have been developed and refined in classified facilities for decades. The same networks that possessed advanced surgical equipment in 1904 have had over a century to develop applications that might be decades ahead of publicly available technology. Consider how this affects your understanding of current medical capabilities. If tissue preservation and life extension techniques existed in primitive form over a century ago, what level of technological sophistication might these networks possess today? If consciousness manipulation was being researched in 1904, what capabilities for controlling human identity and memory might be possible now? The equipment Eliza documented wasn't just advanced for its time, it was to typical development of technologies that would eventually enable unprecedented control over biological processes, consciousness, and human enhancement. The networks conducting these experiments weren't just ahead of their time, they were developing the foundation for capabilities that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in human civilization. Every medical breakthrough that has surprised the public by its sudden appearance might actually represent controlled disclosure of technologies that were developed decades earlier in facilities like the Crawford Mine, where human experimentation could proceed without ethical constraints or public oversight. The psychological impact of Eliza's discoveries extends far beyond her personal trauma to reveal fundamental truths about how reality is constructed and controlled by networks that operate beyond public awareness. Her transformation from a respected community member to a discredited witness demonstrates how quickly individual credibility can be destroyed when someone threatens to expose operations that powerful interests need to keep hidden. The systematic nature of her character assassination, medical professionals declaring her mentally incompetent, law enforcement dismissing her evidence, community members accepting official narratives about her condition, shows how multiple institutions coordinate to control public perception and eliminate inconvenient witnesses through social isolation rather than physical violence. Her recognition that the truth exists in a place beyond my reach represents the psychological breaking point that occurs when individuals realize they are facing organizational systems with resources and authority that exceed their ability to resist or expose. This understanding that certain truths are protected by networks too powerful for individual opposition creates the despair that precedes either surrender or desperate final resistance. The psychological techniques used against Eliza, chemical incapacitation, social isolation, systematic gaslighting, and implied threats of permanent institutionalization, represent early applications of methods that would later be refined and applied on much larger scales for population control and social management. Her decision to continue documenting evidence, even under systematic persecution, demonstrates the kind of moral courage that makes individual witnesses so dangerous to institutional operations that rely on secrecy. Even when facing certain elimination, she continued to create records that could eventually expose what she had discovered. The psychological warfare techniques developed for destroying Eliza's credibility and will became templates for managing contemporary witnesses, activists, and researchers who threaten to expose operations that cannot withstand public scrutiny. Understanding how these methods work is crucial for recognizing when they are being applied to discredit individuals who possess dangerous knowledge about contemporary operations. The geographic distribution of similar operations throughout American history suggests that Devil's Den was part of a network of sites selected for their operational advantages rather than an isolated experiment. Remote locations with specific characteristics, natural concealment, limited government oversight, sparse populations, and transportation access have been systematically utilized for activities that require absolute secrecy. The pattern established in Arkansas mountains was replicated in isolated military installations, remote research facilities, offshore platforms, and underground complexes throughout the 20th century. Each location provided similar advantages: geographic isolation for operational security, natural features for concealment, and limited population density to minimize witnesses and reduce acquisition risks for human subjects. The sophistication required to identify, acquire, and prepare multiple sites for coordinated operations indicates institutional backing with resources and authority far exceeding local capabilities. Site selection, infrastructure development, personnel recruitment, and operational coordination all require planning and financing that could only come from organizations with national or international reach. These networks didn't limit their operations to American locations. Similar patterns appear in isolated areas throughout the world where geographic conditions provide operational advantages for activities that cannot withstand public scrutiny. International coordination allows for resource sharing, personnel exchange, and operational redundancy that makes detection and exposure much more difficult. The global nature of these operations means that eliminating one site or exposing one operation doesn't significantly impact the overall network's capabilities. When Devil's Den was compromised, operations simply shifted to other locations where similar experiments could continue without interruption. Understanding the geographic scope of these networks is crucial for recognizing how contemporary operations maintain continuity across multiple sites, jurisdictions, and national boundaries to ensure that exposure of individual facilities doesn't compromise the larger organizational systems they serve. The technological trajectory that began with the experiments Eliza documented has led to contemporary capabilities that would have been unimaginable in 1904. Life extension techniques that were primitive prototypes over a century ago have evolved into sophisticated interventions that can significantly extend human lifespan while maintaining physical and cognitive function at levels that approach those of much younger individuals. Consciousness manipulation technologies have progressed from basic psychological warfare to sophisticated methods for altering memory, perception, and identity that can fundamentally change how individuals understand themselves and their relationship to reality. These capabilities enable unprecedented control over human behavior and social organization that operates below the level of conscious awareness. Biological enhancement technologies have advanced from experimental tissue preservation to systematic genetic modification, cybernetic integration, and neural augmentation that can create individuals with capabilities far exceeding normal human limitations. Enhanced populations possess cognitive, physical, and sensory abilities that make them effectively superhuman compared to unenhanced populations. The networks that began these experiments in places like Devil's Den now possess technological capabilities that enable them to transcend normal human limitations while maintaining control over populations that remain dependent on inferior versions of the same technologies. This represents the ultimate concentration of power in human history, technological advantages that create permanent distinctions between enhanced and unenhanced populations. These capabilities aren't science fiction or theoretical possibilities. They are active technologies being refined and applied by networks that have had over a century to develop applications of the research that began with experiments on human subjects in isolated facilities like the Crawford Mine. The same organizational systems that killed Eliza Thornwood to protect primitive experiments now protect technological capabilities that could reshape human civilization according to the interests of small groups who possess enhancement technologies that the general population cannot access or even imagine. The information control systems that suppressed Eliza's evidence have evolved into comprehensive networks that can eliminate inconvenient information across multiple platforms and institutions simultaneously. Digital surveillance capabilities allow for real-time monitoring of information flows and immediate intervention to prevent dangerous knowledge from reaching public awareness. Academic institutions, media organizations, government agencies, and corporate platforms all participate in coordinated suppression of information that threatens operations requiring secrecy. Publication restrictions, algorithmic content suppression, search result manipulation, and social media censorship all provide mechanisms for controlling what information reaches public consciousness. The sophistication of contemporary suppression systems makes the techniques used against Dr. Calloway in 1964 appear primitive by comparison. Digital footprints can be eliminated, online archives can be modified or deleted, and alternative narratives can be promoted through coordinated information campaigns that make suppressed information appear discredited or irrelevant, even when it remains technically accessible. But these same systems create vulnerabilities that didn't exist in Eliza's time. Digital preservation means that information can survive in multiple formats and locations despite suppression attempts. Distributed networks allow for coordination between individuals who possess fragments of dangerous knowledge but lack access to complete pictures. The challenge for contemporary witnesses is not just preserving information, but ensuring it reaches audiences capable of understanding its significance and taking action to expose the systems it reveals. Information without action remains harmless to networks that depend on public ignorance and apathy for operational security. Understanding how information control systems work is crucial for recognizing when they are being applied to suppress knowledge about contemporary operations that continue the work that began in facilities like the Crawford mine over a century ago. The same networks that eliminated Eliza's evidence continue to eliminate information that threatens their technological advantages and operational security. The human cause of the research that began in Devil's Den extends far beyond the individuals who were directly victimized in facilities like the Crawford mine. Every technological breakthrough achieved through unauthorized human experimentation represents the suffering of unknown numbers of subjects who had no voice, no advocates, and no legal protection from organizations that viewed them as expendable resources for advancing research objectives. The life extension technologies that emerged from these experiments came at the cost of countless individuals who were subjected to procedures that violated every ethical principle while contributing to knowledge that would eventually benefit only small groups with access to enhanced capabilities. The preservation techniques, consciousness manipulation methods, and biological enhancement technologies all required human subjects for development and refinement. But the broader human cost includes the systematic degradation of institutions that were supposed to protect individual rights and promote human welfare. Medical establishments that participated in unauthorized experimentation, law enforcement agencies that suppressed evidence and eliminated witnesses, academic institutions that buried inconvenient research, and media organizations that concealed systematic human rights violations all became corrupted in ways that continue to affect their ability to serve legitimate purposes. The networks that conducted these experiments understood that achieving technological supremacy required corrupting every institution that could potentially expose or resist their operations. By recruiting complicit professionals, compromising oversight systems, and eliminating moral constraints, they created organizational environments where human experimentation could proceed without interference. The institutional corruption that enabled the Devil's Den experiments hasn't been eliminated. It has been expanded and systematized to support contemporary operations that continue to advance technological capabilities through methods that would horrify anyone with functioning moral principles. Every institution you trust to protect your rights and welfare has been compromised to serve interests that view individual human beings as expendable resources for advancing research objectives. What happened to Eliza Thornwood in 1904 continues to happen today. The same networks that eliminated her to protect primitive experiments now eliminate contemporary witnesses who threaten to expose technological capabilities that have advanced far beyond what she could have imagined. The same institutional systems that suppressed her evidence continue to suppress information about operations that rely on public ignorance for operational security. The experiments she documented weren't historical curiosities that ended with her death. They were the beginning of research programs that have continued for over a century, advancing through multiple generations of technological development while maintaining the same organizational structures and operational methods that made Devil's Den possible. Today's witnesses face elimination risks that dwarf what Eliza confronted. Contemporary networks possess global reach, digital surveillance capabilities, and enhancement technologies that make them effectively invulnerable to individual opposition. Yet the same moral courage that drove Eliza to document evidence despite certain death continues to inspire individuals who risk everything to expose truth that powerful interests need to keep hidden. Your awareness of this history places you in the same category as every other witness who has learned too much about operations that cannot withstand public scrutiny. The knowledge you now possess about how these networks operate, how they eliminate witnesses, and how they suppress information makes you a potential threat that must be managed through the same techniques used against Eliza and countless others who discovered inconvenient truths. The question that confronts you now is the same question that confronted Eliza Thornwood when she realized what she was facing. Will you remain silent to protect your safety, or will you risk everything to ensure that others learn what you have discovered? Will you allow this knowledge to die with you, or will you find ways to preserve and transmit it despite the risks involved? The networks that killed Eliza Thornwood are counting on your silence. They depend on witnesses who choose personal safety over moral obligation, who prioritize individual survival over collective awakening. But they also understand that some individuals will choose resistance regardless of consequences, which is why they continue to refine elimination techniques and develop new methods for managing exposure risks. The truth that Eliza died to preserve now lives in your consciousness. What you do with that knowledge will determine whether her sacrifice contributes to eventual exposure of the systems that destroyed her, or whether it dies with another silenced witness in the long history of suppressed truth. The choice is yours. But remember, they're watching. They're always watching. And they remember everyone who learns what they're not supposed to know. The rabbit hole doesn't end here. It only gets deeper.